These people, they did not come from Sweden, okay? Look at what happened in Paris. Look at what happened last week in California with 14 people dead.
Bureaucrats think they can run over your lives, overrule your values, meddle in your faith, and tell you how to live, what to say, and where to pray.
The government is going to pay the money directly to you. It goes to you, and then you take the money and buy your own health care.
There are questions people argue about, and then there are questions no one dares to ask. Donald Trump has been investigated, impeached, defeated, and re-elected into relevance more times than any modern political figure. Every scandal becomes noise. Every accusation becomes fuel. Every attack seems to make him stronger. But in all the shouting, one question remains untouched. Not because it lacks importance, because asking it breaks the rules. This question doesn't come from his enemies. They're too busy attacking him. It doesn't come from the media. They're too busy covering the chaos. And it doesn't come from his supporters, because for them, the question feels dangerous. Trump survives because the debate is always framed the same way: guilty or innocent, hero or villain, savior or threat. Those questions are safe. They keep everyone divided.
Religious liberty. Hey, it's about religious liberty. And there has to be a melding of both. We're living in a time where you have to have a melding of both.
The forbidden question does something else. It doesn't attack Trump. It doesn't defend him. It forces something far more uncomfortable. It forces a reckoning with power. And once that question is asked clearly, the story is no longer just about Donald Trump. It becomes about all of us. For most of modern political history, power has relied on a shared understanding of restraint. Not written law alone, but informal limits. Lines that were technically crossable, but rarely crossed. Presidents avoided certain behaviors not because they were illegal, but because they were understood to be destabilizing. The system depended on that understanding. Donald Trump did not accept that arrangement. From the moment he entered politics, he treated every norm as optional and every limit as negotiable. If something wasn't explicitly forbidden, he tested it. If backlash followed, he measured whether it actually mattered. And if consequences failed to materialize, the lesson was clear. The line never truly existed. This was not recklessness. It was observation. Trump learned that institutions speak loudly but move slowly. That outrage arrives instantly but fades quickly. That legal processes are complex, delayed, and easily reframed as persecution. And most importantly, he learned that attention protects more effectively than silence ever could. Each controversy reinforced the same pattern. Rules were challenged. Reaction exploded. The system hesitated. Trump survived. Over time, survival itself became proof, not of innocence, but of invincibility. Supporters pointed to this endurance as evidence that Trump was untouchable because he was right. Critics pointed to it as evidence that the system was broken. But neither interpretation addressed the core issue. The system was never built to handle someone who refuses to internalize its unwritten rules. That refusal exposed a structural weakness. Democracies are designed to function when participants share a baseline respect for institutions. When leaders accept not just what they can do, but what they should not do. When losing power does not mean losing identity. Trump challenged all of that. He treated loss as theft, opposition as illegitimacy, and compromise as surrender. And because the system had no clear mechanism to address those behaviors decisively,
It happens too often with these people. You see them, but look, this is how they come in. This is how they're standing on top of each other. And
it defaulted to procedures that were never meant to operate at this intensity. The result was paralysis disguised as process. While courts deliberated and committees investigated, Trump remained present, speaking, rallying, reframing. Each delay gave him time to rebuild narratives. Each unanswered question allowed belief to harden into certainty among his base. And belief, once hardened, is nearly impossible to dislodge. This is where the forbidden question becomes unavoidable. If a system cannot decisively respond to norm-breaking behavior without relying on the good faith of the person breaking norms, then how stable is that system really? This question doesn't accuse Trump of wrongdoing. It questions preparedness. Preparedness for bad faith. Preparedness for constant pressure. Preparedness for leaders who do not care about legitimacy, only leverage. Trump forced institutions to reveal that much of their power is symbolic, dependent on compliance, dependent on tradition, dependent on shared belief. When those dependencies are withdrawn, enforcement weakens. This is why everything around Trump feels unresolved, because resolution requires authority, and authority requires consensus. Trump thrives in environments where consensus is impossible, where every action can be framed as partisan, where accountability itself becomes political. The system was never designed for permanent combat.
And that, I view that as being really respect for our country the way they did it, because last night was beautiful.
It assumed cycles, elections, transitions, cooling periods. Trump eliminated cooling periods. He kept the conflict alive even when out of office. He kept himself central even when removed from formal power. That continuity is not accidental. It is structural exploitation, and here lies the deeper discomfort. If Trump exposed these weaknesses once, others can do it again, perhaps more quietly, perhaps more efficiently, perhaps without the chaos that makes Trump so visible. This is why the question remains suppressed. Because once you acknowledge that Trump is not an exception, but a preview, the conversation shifts from outrage to reform, from personality to architecture, from blame to redesign. And redesign is threatening. It threatens those who benefit from the current media economy. It threatens parties that rely on polarization. It threatens institutions that prefer reverence to scrutiny. So the system keeps the focus on Trump, the man, not Trump, the test. But tests don't disappear when ignored. They repeat. And unless the question is finally asked, clearly, honestly, without allegiance, the conditions that produced this moment will remain intact, waiting. Avoiding the question has consequences, even if they aren't immediately visible. In fact, the longer it is avoided, the more normalized the damage becomes. What feels like stability is often just delay. What feels like survival is often erosion. When a system repeatedly encounters a stress test and responds with hesitation, people learn from that hesitation. Politicians learn what they can get away with. Media learns what drives attention. Voters learn that outrage replaces resolution. And over time, expectations quietly reset. Trump did not just challenge institutions. He trained everyone watching. He trained supporters to see accountability as persecution. He trained opponents to rely on exposure instead of solutions. He trained institutions to move cautiously in moments that required clarity. And once that training takes hold, it doesn't disappear when the individual does. This is the cost of never asking the deeper question. Because without that question, every future conflict will be framed the same way. Loud, personal, and endlessly circular. Each side will feel justified. Each side will feel threatened. And the system will continue to operate in crisis mode, mistaking endurance for health. The most dangerous outcome here is not collapse. It is repetition. A democracy can survive one disruptive figure. What it struggles to survive is a template, a repeatable strategy, a playbook that proves you can dominate attention, challenge norms, and remain central without ever resolving the underlying conflict. Trump's greatest impact may not be what he did, but what he demonstrated. He demonstrated that legality and legitimacy are not the same thing. That outrage can substitute for consequence. That belief, once mobilized, can overpower process. And once those lessons are learned, they cannot be unlearned. This is why the question is so threatening. Because answering it requires admitting that something fundamental is misaligned, that the system relies too heavily on voluntary restraint, that informal rules carry too much weight.
Are issuing a new decree to be heard in every city in every foreign capital.
That media incentives reward conflict over clarity, admitting that would demand change. And change is uncomfortable. It would require slowing the cycle, redesigning accountability mechanisms, rethinking how attention is rewarded, rebuilding trust not through spectacle, but through confidence and consistency. None of that benefits a system addicted to urgency. So instead, the argument continues exactly where it is safest, around Trump himself. His words, his behavior, his intentions, his personality. But personalities are easy targets. Systems are not. As long as Trump remains the focus, the structure remains untouched. That is why even now, after years of analysis, investigations, and debate, the story still feels unresolved. Because the resolution everyone expects cannot arrive until the conversation changes shape. The question no one is allowed to ask is not forbidden because it is radical. It is forbidden because it is practical, because it forces a shift from moral judgment to structural responsibility. And structural responsibility threatens comfort on all sides. Supporters would have to admit that strength does not equal sustainability. Critics would have to admit that condemnation without reform is hollow. Institutions would have to admit that tradition is not enforcement. Those admissions are harder than outrage. So the question stays buried, resurfacing only in fragments, in academic discussions, in quiet editorials, in late-night conversations where certainty gives way to doubt. But buried questions don't disappear. They apply pressure. And pressure, over time, reshapes everything. Trump may or may not remain central to American politics. His influence may grow, shrink, or transform, but the conditions he revealed are already part of the landscape. They will shape the next crisis, the next figure, the next moment when belief collides with structure. The real danger is not that the question goes unanswered forever. It's that the system keeps proving again and again that it cannot answer it. And if that continues, the next test will not look like an anomaly. It will look like inevitability. As the conversation refuses to evolve, something subtle but significant happens beneath the surface. The center of gravity shifts. Power no longer flows primarily through institutions or outcomes, but through perception management. The ability to define reality, to frame events before they are fully understood, becomes more influential than authority itself. This is the environment Trump did not just navigate, but mastered. In such an environment, the truth becomes less important than timing. The loudest interpretation arrives first and hardens before alternatives can form. By the time facts are established, belief has already settled. And once belief settles, evidence is no longer evaluated on its merits. It is evaluated on whether it reinforces identity. This is not unique to Trump, but Trump exploited it at scale. The refusal to ask the deeper question allowed this dynamic to spread unchecked. Media organizations learned that constant conflict drove engagement better than resolution ever could.
But tomorrow the headlines are going to be Donald Trump rants and... I'm not ranting on that. Go ahead.
I mean, just one more follow-up.
Should I let him have a little bit more? What do you think,
just
Peter?
because of this.
Political actors learned that escalation energized bases more effectively than governance. Voters learned to consume politics as spectacle rather than process. And slowly, the line between participation and performance dissolved. The consequences of this are not dramatic in the moment. They are cumulative. Institutions begin to speak more cautiously, not out of wisdom, but fear of backlash. Leaders become less decisive, not because they lack authority, but because authority has become negotiable. Every decision is filtered through optics first, impact second. This is how erosion works, not by collapse, but by adaptation to dysfunction. The most telling sign of this shift is how language changes. Words like truth, law, and accountability become elastic. They are invoked selectively, applied unevenly, and defended only when convenient. What once anchored debate becomes ammunition within it. Trump did not create this instability, but his rise accelerated it. And because the focus never moved beyond him, the instability was treated as a personality problem rather than a systemic one. Each crisis was framed as an exception, each controversy as unprecedented. That framing made it easier to avoid long-term reform because exceptions don't require redesign. But when exceptions repeat, they are no longer exceptions. They are signals. The signal here is not that the system is doomed, it is that it is outdated. Built for a political culture that no longer exists, designed for leaders who internalize restraint rather than exploit its absence. When Trump challenged norms, the system responded as if he would eventually self-correct. When he didn't, it relied on slow mechanisms meant to discourage bad faith, not confront it head-on. That mismatch created a vacuum, and vacuums attract opportunists. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told because it lacks a villain. It implicates incentives rather than individuals. It asks whether structures designed decades ago can survive an era where attention is currency and outrage is strategy. And that question has no easy answer. What is clear is that avoiding it has a cost. The longer the system operates without examining its own limits, the more those limits are tested. Each unresolved conflict lowers the threshold for the next. Each delayed consequence teaches future actors that delay itself is power. Trump's influence, then, is not confined to his actions. It lives in the precedents he normalized, in the strategies he proved effective, in the realization that dominance of narrative can substitute for legitimacy, at least temporarily.
Soon after, the savior of mankind who brought truth and light into the world was betrayed, arrested, and tried, beaten, and nailed to a cross and crucified.
Temporarily is the key word. Because systems can absorb stress for a long time before they fail. They adapt, they bend, they redistribute pressure, and in doing so, they often appear stable right up until the moment they are not. The danger is not that Trump broke the system. The danger is that the system learned to function while broken. When that happens, repair becomes harder, dysfunction becomes familiar, urgency becomes permanent, and the idea of returning to restraint begins to feel unrealistic, even naive. This is why the unasked question matters so much, because it is the only one that forces a pause, a step back, a shift from reaction to evaluation. It asks whether the current model of politics, endless conflict, endless coverage, endless personalization, is sustainable, and whether future leaders will feel compelled to govern or merely to dominate attention. If that question continues to be avoided, the answer will be delivered anyway, through repetition, through escalation, through a future crisis that looks familiar but hits harder. Trump may be remembered as a singular figure, or he may be remembered as the first clear warning. The difference depends on whether the system chooses introspection over distraction, and that choice has not yet been made. If the question continues to remain unasked, the future it prepares is not dramatic in the way people expect. There is no single breaking point, no moment where everything collapses at once. What emerges instead is something far more difficult to recognize and far harder to reverse. Normalization. The extraordinary becomes routine. The unacceptable becomes debatable. The destabilizing becomes familiar. When that happens, systems don't fail loudly. They thin out. Their authority becomes conditional. Their responses become symbolic rather than corrective. People stop expecting resolution and start expecting theater. This is the quiet inheritance of the Trump era, not a political outcome, but a behavioral one. Future leaders observe what worked. They notice that dominating attention mattered more than consistency, that refusing to concede ground mattered more than credibility. That conflict could replace governance as long as it kept supporters emotionally engaged. And crucially, they notice that consequences, when they arrive at all, arrive late. This teaches a dangerous lesson. Endurance equals success. Once that belief spreads, restraint no longer looks like responsibility. It looks like weakness. Cooperation looks like surrender. Silence looks like loss. And escalation becomes the default setting for anyone seeking relevance or power. The system begins rewarding the very behavior it struggles to contain. This is why the unasked question is not academic. It is preventative, because the question is not really about Trump's character or intentions. It is about thresholds, about how much strain institutions can absorb before adaptation turns into acceptance, about whether democratic culture can survive when every incentive pushes towards spectacle instead of stability. Trump forced institutions to operate at maximum stress for extended periods of time. And instead of breaking, they adapted, they slowed, they hedged, they became cautious where clarity was needed, procedural where decisiveness mattered. That adaptation is now baked in. You can see it in how quickly controversies blur together, in how rarely accountability feels final, in how often the public response is exhaustion rather than outrage. Exhaustion is not neutrality, it is vulnerability. Because a tired public is easier to distract, easier to polarize, easier to mobilize emotionally without engaging substantively. When fatigue replaces engagement, democracy becomes hollow, still functioning, but less responsive, less demanding, less protected. This is the future shaped by avoidance, not authoritarianism overnight, but erosion over time, a gradual lowering of expectations, a quiet acceptance that politics is inherently chaotic, institutions are inherently slow, and nothing ever really gets resolved. And in that environment, the next disruptive figure does not need to be as loud as Trump. They do not need to be as polarizing. They only need to understand the terrain Trump revealed. They will know where norms are weakest, where delays can be exploited, where outrage can be weaponized, where belief can be mobilized faster than fact. They will inherit a system already stretched thin. That is the cost of never asking the deeper question. It leaves no map for reform, only a trail of symptoms treated as isolated events, each one handled with urgency, none with redesign. The irony is that many people on all sides sense this intuitively. They feel that something fundamental has shifted, even if they can't articulate what. They feel less confident in outcomes, less trusting of processes, less certain that rules mean what they once did. But without the right question, that discomfort has nowhere to go. It turns inward as cynicism, or outward as rage, or sideways as disengagement. None of those responses strengthen a system. Trump's legacy, then, may not be written in laws or court rulings. It may be written in expectations, in what future leaders assume they can do, in what institutions assume they must tolerate, in what the public assumes is normal. That is why the question remains so dangerous, because it forces a choice. Either this era is treated as a warning, a signal that structures must evolve to meet new realities, or it is treated as entertainment, endlessly replayed, endlessly debated, until its lessons are forgotten and its patterns repeated. History shows that systems rarely choose introspection on their own. They are pushed into it by pressure, by failure, or by foresight. Right now, foresight is the only option that avoids damage, and foresight begins with a question that reframes everything, not around Trump as a person, but around what his rise, endurance, and dominance revealed about the machinery underneath. There is still one final step in this story, because recognizing the question is not the same as answering it, and what happens next depends entirely on whether anyone is willing to do more than just notice the problem. In the end, the most revealing part of this story is not Donald Trump himself. It is how difficult it has been to move beyond him. Years of debate, investigation, outrage, and analysis have produced enormous volume, but very little resolution. Not because answers are unavailable, but because the wrong questions keep being asked. Questions that keep the fight alive instead of forcing understanding. The one question no one is allowed to ask was never meant to indict or absolve Trump. It was meant to expose a deeper truth, that modern systems of power are struggling to function in an era where attention outweighs authority, speed outruns process, and belief replaces accountability. Trump did not break those systems. He revealed how close they already were to breaking. That distinction matters, because if the problem is framed as one man, then removing the man feels like a solution. But if the problem is structural, embedded in incentives, media dynamics, political culture, and public behavior, then removing one figure changes very little. Another will follow, another will test the same limits. Another will exploit the same weaknesses. The question, then, is not whether Trump was an anomaly. It is whether the system learned anything from him. Did institutions strengthen their ability to act decisively under pressure? Did media rethink how conflict is rewarded? Did political culture reclaim restraint as a virtue rather than a liability? Did the public demand clarity instead of spectacle? Those answers remain uncertain, and uncertainty is dangerous because it invites repetition. The Trump era has already altered expectations. What once felt unthinkable now feels possible. What once felt disqualifying now feels debatable. What once felt urgent now feels exhausting. That shift did not happen overnight, and it will not be reversed quickly. But it can be addressed if the conversation changes. That requires moving away from personality-driven conflict and toward system-level examination, away from endless reaction and toward deliberate reform, away from asking who is winning the fight and toward asking whether the fight itself is sustainable. This is not a comfortable shift. It offers no easy villains and no simple heroes. It demands accountability without spectacle and reform without applause. It requires patience in a culture addicted to urgency. But without that shift, the cycle continues. The loudest voices dominate. The deepest questions remain buried, and the same vulnerabilities wait to be exploited again. Donald Trump will eventually exit the center of the story, one way or another. History guarantees that. What is not guaranteed is whether the conditions that elevated him will exit with him. That is the real unresolved issue. That is the real legacy at stake, and that is why the question matters. If this analysis challenged how you think about power, politics, and accountability, then the conversation is doing its job. These stories are not meant to provide comfort. They are meant to provide clarity. If you want more long-form documentaries that go beyond headlines, stories that examine the psychology, structures, and consequences behind public figures and movements, stay with this channel. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who is tired of noise and looking for understanding. Because the future will not be shaped by the questions we argue over. It will be shaped by the questions we finally decide to ask.